Hello. Welcome to yesterlore. I see there's already people in the chat. Thank you for showing up so soon. Sorry it was a couple minutes late. I just had to get some water, just so I could stay hydrated. My throat gets very dry as I'm reading these poems sometimes. But welcome. So, I'm a little bit ambitious tonight. I think I want to get through at least 3, if not 4, maybe even 5 of these rune poems. We've been going kind of slow the last few times because I had to circle back and talk about some prior ones. But we're going to get started with our first one today pretty soon. And it's a pretty easy one in terms of guessing what the meaning is, because the name that George Hicks writes for us in his margins here, if we look at his version here, if you know what this rune represents in terms of its value, and then you look at these 2 letters, you already have the answer, and I've written it out here. Man. Technically, in sort of more standard Old English, you'd tend to see double N here, but it kind of depends on the scribe and the place in the text that you're in, but usually etymologically there should be 2 N's, although the etymology is a little murky itself in terms of whatever the Proto-Germanic is, whether it had 1 or 2 N's. It's all very tricky. But when we see this word in other cases, like the dative and the genitive and most of the plural declensions, it usually has 2 N's. So it probably has 2 N's inherently. But when we have double letters at the end of words in Old English, oftentimes you just see 1 written, especially in these later texts. Now, before I read this, I do want to talk about an emendation before we start that's typically made. And it's this word over here that you see. It looks like it's O-D-R-U-M. Now, most people are pretty agreed that this is probably actually an ev here. And reminder, this is what ev looks like. It's basically just the D with the crossbar through it. Now, if we look back at George Hicks's version that we have, he pretty distinctly writes D versus ev. So it might not be a mistake in terms of him copying it from the manuscript. Because if we look here, here's his D here. This oldrum is how this would be read, oldrum. Versus his eds, which he very dramatically puts the bar on it. So he probably saw what he thought was a D in the original manuscript. But if we look back at this font here, we can kind of see, if I undo that change, how similar they are. And maybe the original scribe didn't write the bar clearly enough, or it was smudged, or maybe the original scribe just forgot to cross his ed, kind of like someone might forget to dot their I or cross their T or something if they're writing in cursive nowadays. Could just be a scribal error, but most people are pretty agreed that this is actually the word oldrum, because it makes the most sense when we're trying to translate it. So that's the first emendation I would make. And with that done, I don't think there's any other emendations. Let me just check real quick before I go ahead and read this. I think we're all good. Yeah, we should be good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read this in Old English first, and then I'm going to read this in sort of go word by word and then try to get us to a modern English translation to try to understand what is this poem saying about this rune. All right, here we go. Man bith on mirthe is magan leof. Shalthach andre jehulch odrum swikan. For tham drichten wille dome sine, that arme flash eordan betakan. So, the first word is the rune, which we usually skip when we're doing this translation so people have a chance to guess. But there isn't much of a guess here. This is just the modern English word man. Although there are some notes I want to give about this word. In Old English, it's a lot more common for this word to be understood in a non-gendered sense, sort of. It means like person. Now, it is grammatically masculine, and as we've seen with all these sort of formulae for that are general words for person, they're usually masculine words, not just in terms of the grammatical gender, but in terms of the meaning. They're usually referring to warriors or princes or nobles or something like that. So even though this word, we tend to think of it in a sort of more person sense, often when we're trying to like make sure of what the sense is in Old English, it's not incorrect to translate it as man, because the other sort of layer here is that men were kind of considered the default. So it is gender neutral in terms of its sense. It can equally apply to women as it can men in Old English, although it usually doesn't. Not be just because the word is limited to gender, though. It's just because of the gender dynamics in the culture at the time. And so when we see sort of archaic uses of men nowadays, when people say men, they mean everyone, but they're saying men. Men has a lot more of a like very specific gendered sense now than it did in Old English. Yeah, someone in the chat is saying cringe, yeah. But in Old English it does mean person, because we have plenty of more specific words that very much do refer to gender specifically in Old English. The clearest one is probably the word wer in Old English for man, as in the gender, as opposed to just man, which is a person. And we also see man as sort of a second element in compound. So we see like werman for male person and weefman for female person. Weef means woman. But weefman, that compound, is actually where we get the modern word woman. So that man part of woman is actually this word here, man, meaning person. So I would translate this personally as person. So a person. But translating it as man isn't entirely wrong, just because man and person were kind of synonymous. Although, again, I'll emphasize, this doesn't have a strict gender connotation like man tends to now in modern English. But in any case, sorry, it keeps jumping around. I'm pressing side arrows, but it's interpreting that as like me going down the page for some reason. Yeah, so man, person, a person, bith on miritha is magan leof. So man is, this is word bith we've had in most of the rune poems so far, bith on mirtha. Mirtha means mirth. You'll see there's this G here, mirtha, because this is actually the noun derivation from the adjective mir, which is merry. It's where Mary comes from. Hello, chat. So mirtha is mirth, or, merriment, because miri is merry. So that's actually how we have like these two very different words. I'm going to actually type them out here. Merry, the adjective, as in happy, and mirth, as in joy. They come from the same root. They come from this word mir, and mirth is just the sort of noun form of merry, the adjective. So mirth is mirth. So, or I guess mirth is sort of the modern descendant. It's just like happiness, joy. There are a lot of Old English words for joy we've seen. We've seen win was one of the actual runes that meant joy. So we have a person, man bith on miritha. A person is in joy. His magan leof. So his here refers back to man. And again, I'll emphasize, the only reason it's his here is just because man is grammatically masculine. Now, it's also probable that the assumption is that this person is a man, but man doesn't necessarily imply the gender of the person. It's just the gender of the word here, his. Magan leof. Now, here, magan is his family. So, and it's not in the nominative or accusative case, it's actually it could actually be in the accusative case, but it's probably the dative case. So to his family. Leof. Leof is an adjective meaning beloved or dear. So this is actually the complement here to bith. So a person is dear to his family. Sorry, I keeps registering my click as a right click for some reason. So a person is dear to his family in joy. A person in joy or a person in mirth is dear to his family. Now, there seems to be a few different ways to translate that. A person who is joyful, a person who is in joy, is dear to his family. That's kind of a depressing way to translate that, in my opinion, because it implies that they're not dear when they're not happy. But the other way to translate this is a person is dear to his family in joy. Like, because they're dear to their family, they're joyful because they have this family member. Just having a person in your family is a good thing, right? Especially if you're living in a time where it's really easy to lose someone in your family, just given how hard life is in Anglo-Saxon England. Having any family member is something that they would have been very happy about. Then we have shall thach andre jehwilch odrum swekan. Now, here shall is where we get the word shall from. We've had it a few times, but we know at this point that shall usually has more of a strong meaning of like must, like it's required, or owed. So must, thach, we've had this word before too. It's where we get the word though from, thach. Here it's like though or but must, who must? Andre jehwilch. We've had quite a few of these jehwilch or ihwilch after a word that ends with a. This is another sort of genitive plural person. And this is the word on. On is one, like the number one, just in the genitive plural. It's andre. So each of ones, basically, it's another one of these formulae that means everyone. But everyone shall, though, everyone shall, odrum swekan. Swekan is the verb here. Swekan means, or it's not the main verb is shall, but swekan is sort of like what they must do. They must swekan. Now swekan, it can mean just like to depart, to go off. But it also, when we have a dative here this is a dative for odrum, and odrum, this is the word other, which means other. It's where we get the word other from. It also means second as a numeral. Other is second. Fruma is first. Or sorry, not fruma. Forma is first. And other is second. But here it probably means other because it's plural, others. And it's dative with this suffix, which when we match that with swekan, that basically means to leave from someone. So when we have this word and then a dative, it's kind of like a dative of escape. You're like leaving someone. You're departing with respect to them is what this dative is sort of getting across. So a person is beloved, is dear to their family in joy, though everyone must depart or leave from others. Probably their others, their fellows, their kinsmen. Everyone must leave someone else, leave another. At some point, people are going to leave for whatever reason that may be. And here is an example of why. Kinfolk. Yeah, maga here is the word here. Maga is kin. Here. Fortham drichten wille dome sina. Fortham here is like because. Fortham. There are actually a bunch of different ways to write this. Forthum, forthon, forthan. We see a lot of them. It's for that, like for that reason. Forthan drichten Wille, dome, sine. Drichten we've had before. We had that way back in, I think, the first rune poem, I think. Drichten means lord. And I think we might have had this in another poem too. It's a really common word for lord. Because lord, wille, here this is will as in wants or wills that something happens. And what does he want? He wants dome sine. He wants his own judgment. Sine, I think we've had this pronoun before. It's a reflexive pronoun. It means sort of one's own. It isn't as common in Old English, but it shows up a lot in Old Norse, actually. And what it does is it actually disambiguates third persons in a really useful way. If we say someone is, let's do a modern English sentence that can be really ambiguous. Let's say you have two people and they both use the same pronouns, so that can get confusing if you're just using pronouns. We might have a sentence like, she ate her or maybe let's do a different verb. She took her I'm trying to think of an item because I want to translate it into Old English as well, so I want to think of easy things to translate back that would be clear. She took her book. Let's just do book. I'm just thinking of words that rhyme with took. It won't rhyme in Old English because we're going to use a different verb for to take. Now, her could be ambiguous here, especially if we've talked about two different people using she, her pronouns in a previous sentence. She took her book could mean two things. She took her book could mean she took her as in her own, so the antecedent, we call it, would be the same person. Or it could be another person who has a book. It might be clearer if I have a another sentence before, like let's say, oh gosh, I'm fighting the temptation to just pick names that come from Old English because that would be fun, but I think I'll just do like letters, maybe like J went to K's room. Then we have she took her book. So the problem we have here, well, now we have two problems. We don't know who she is. But let's say both J and K use she, her pronouns. We have this ambiguity issue. Let's say J, like she is J. That much we know. But who does her refer to? Does her refer back to J? Or does her refer to K? Is it K's book or J's book? That's ambiguous in English. The way we'd have to clarify that is with repeating a name or some other strategy. Now, some grammarians will say that her has to be one or the other based on like which one is more recent. They're sort of like the most recent antecedent. But in actual spoken English, people don't actually follow that rule. So it is ambiguous. So in Old English, though, it's not used very often in Old English, which tells us that it was already kind of on its way out in the Old English period, but we see an example of it here. It's used a lot more in Old Norse. But basically what you can do is you have like J went to K's room. And actually I'm going to write both sentences. This one is where like her refers to K, like it's K's book, and then I'll do another one where J took her own book. And like I just did in English, I said own, and that kind of clarifies that. That's one of the strategies we can use to fix the ambiguity. Her own book. We might use the word own. What this would be in Old English when we're using this strategy of a different pronoun is that if it's K's book, we'll say her book. We'll use the pronoun hira in Old English, hira. But if it's J's own book, we're actually going to use sine. That's when we'll use this pronoun sine here. It's her as in her own. The person who we just priorly mentioned is taking their own book. And the reason I bring this up is that's what's going on here. A lord will his own doom. His doom, doma. I wouldn't translate this as doom, actually. I'm just saying. Doma is where we get the word doom. Dom. It's a long O. We'll get to the translation in just a second. But it's the whatever this dome is, it refers back to Drichten. It belongs to the Lord here. So sorry for that long tangent, but I just wanted to explain this pronoun, why there are different words for one's own versus his or her. And the other thing that you might notice about Sina is it could be used for him or her. Here we have a masculine word, Drichten, but you could also use it for feminine nouns. It doesn't really differentiate the gender of the owner, but it will agree with the gender of the thing that is owned. And that's, I think, another reason why it might have gone out of style in Old English, because the words his and her don't agree with the gender of the thing that's owned, but seen usually does. And it will have to decline as well. You see there's this E here because doma has an E. I think it's a feminine noun. Yeah, I think it has to be, unless betakon takes a dative or genitive thing. Well, if it's genitive, again, it has to be feminine. I'm pretty sure dome is feminine. I could double check that, though. In any case, not super important for the translation. Because the Lord will his dome. Dome in Old English, it's where we get the word doom from, but it basically means judgment. And I think we actually had this with Drichten way back in the first rune poem too. I'm actually going to go up to the rune poem here just because I keep... Yeah, there we go. For Drichtne domes leotan. And we talked a lot about this word leotan back then. But Drichtne domes is the judgment or the doom of the Lord. So, here we have a kind of similar theme. The Lord's judgment. That arma flash eorthan betaka. Now, it takes a really long time to actually get what the Lord will do with his doom. He will betakan, and I'll go back to this, but I'm just trying to translate in order. The Lord will betakan domesina. Betakan here is like to deliver, to bring to, or maybe even teach. Betakan. I think it's betakan and not betachan. I might be mistaken, but I think it's betakan. I will double check that as well in just a second. I just want to get through the translation. So the Lord will deliver his own judgment. And then we have that arma flash. Eorthan. Oh, you know what? Domesina isn't the object of betakon. That arma flash is. Domesina is probably then sort of an adverbial prepositional phrase. Well, not prepositional phrase. It's an adverbial dative here. So it is dative. So I might have been wrong about dom being feminine. Actually, upon further thought, I think dom might actually be masculine. So it's in his own judgment, deliver that arma flash. Flash, as you might be able to guess from how it sounds, it's flesh. And it's neuter because of that. This abbreviation we've seen before, it's the word that would otherwise be spelled out like this, that. But there's abbreviation where it's just a thorn with a line through it. That. Arm, flash. An arm, I think we've had before. It means sort of weak, feeble. I think we saw it for poor before. When we had like the nobles and the poor, like the rich and the poor. I think we'll have that again today, mayhaps, if we get to it. So the feeble or weak flesh, eorthan, to the earth. Sorry, I see a thorn and I'm reading it as a thorn, but it should be pronounced like an edith. Eorthan betakan. So let me read it one more time in Old English, and then I'll read it out in modern English as we've translated it. So, man bydd on miriatha his magan leof, shall thach anra je huilch odrum sweekan, for tham drichten wille dome sina that arme flash erdan betakan. So it's a person is dear to his family in joy, though each person must leave their fellows, because the Lord will deliver the feeble flesh in his own judgment to the earth. So I think in this one, it's really hard not to interpret drichten here in a Christian way. Before it was kind of ambiguous. When we had drichtne domus, there were kind of different ways to translate it. But I think here, it seems pretty Christian, this poem. But it's kind of difficult to make sense of exactly what is meant here. The Lord will deliver the feeble flesh in his own judgment unto the earth. And that's why each person must leave their fellows. I think this might be saying, eventually we're going to die. And so the Lord will put us down into the earth. The Lord, in his own judgment, will deliver the feeble flesh, like the dead body, into the earth. The Lord's going to decide when you die, basically. So that's why a person is beloved in joy to their family, because all of us are going to have to die. So that's a really interesting thing to be emphasizing about this rune. Now, I did want to say one other thing about this rune, man, here, and it's that this rune is one of the runes that does show up in a lot of manuscripts that are not predominantly runic, like they're just written out in these types of letters that we've been seeing in a lot of the Old English manuscripts we've read in yesterlore. But then this rune in particular will appear as a sort of abbreviation of the word man. This happens a lot in Old Icelandic documents as well. They'll use their rune that means the same thing that we'll get to when we get to those rune poems, as a sort of way of abbreviating or like shorthanding the word man. It saves space just to use the rune instead of the 3 letters, or 4, depending on how you're spelling it at the time. So this is definitely a rune that pops up in other places, not just in runic texts. So it's a good one to know. All right, let's move on to the next one. And this one, I think, is one that could maybe be guessable if we skip the name, like skip what the name means. I think it might be a little too clear, but we'll get to it anyway. So I'm going to start reading in Old English, and then we'll get into words. Wait, actually, let me check if there's anything that needs to be amended. Oh yes, I think there is something that needs to be amended. Okay, I think the thing here is that usually people will amend this word here to be a verb in the third person, like yimeth or something like that, or yimeth. We could spell it either way, thorn or ez, it doesn't really matter. Hicks just has it as yim. Now, yim is a noun. It means gem. That's where the word gem comes from. Yim or yum. But that doesn't make any sense here. It needs to be a verb. Now, it could be that it's yimma in the subjunctive, but I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. It could make sense, but then my question then becomes, why is this not subjunctive? Because I'd expect this to be breyen, and not breath if it were subjunctive. Subjunctive just basically means like you're dealing with sort of a hypothetical or reported speech situation in Old English. So Most people will amend this to yimeth here instead of yim. Maybe the scribe felt it was obvious and didn't write it. Maybe it was smudged or burned. We don't have the original document because it was burned in a fire. So we can't know. We just have this copy of it where George Hicks ends it at yim. So we don't know why, but it makes no sense to be yim. So most people added a verb ending here to make it make sense. So I'm going to do that as well and read it as if that's there. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Lago bethleudum langsum jethucht. Yefishulon nethon on nakan taltum. Antisaida suida breath. Anse brimhenges breedless nayimeth. All right. There are some words here that we've actually had before. I'm trying to see. I know we had brimhenges before. I'm trying to find where it was. I think it was in xiii. Yeah. Brimhenges bringeth. Here we have. And we'll go over what that means again in just a second when we get to it. But so we have lago, which is where we're going to skip, and then we have bith, which is leudum langsum jethucht. So this is an interesting sentence structure here. We have this thing is leudum, and leude, it means people. So leudum is two people. And then we have langsum jethucht. Langsum here, you might be able to guess it has something to do with the word long here. Langsum is like it goes on forever. It's endless. Langsum. It's longsome, basically. It goes on very widely, forever. Now, jethucht here, this is related to the verb thinkan. Oh, actually, I think this is another emendation that I missed. Oh, no, that's not an emendation. That's just me making a typo. See how easy it is to make these typos? I put a win there. It's supposed to be a thorn. Yeah, it's a thorn. And I read it as a thorn. I just... there was a win there for some reason. That's my bad. Yeah. Langsum jethucht. There we go. Jethucht. I was going to say that. That thorn looks like a Middle English thorn, which ends up looking a lot more like a win. Jethucht means seeming. It's from the verb thinkan, which is to seem. And it's an impersonal verb, thinkan. And so usually, when you use thinkan, the person to whom it seems is usually in the dative. So you'll say something like, me thinketh, or me thinks, depending on what dialect you're in. Me thinks, blah, blah, blah. So this is where the term me thinks comes from. Me thinks, the thinks here is actually this verb thinkan, to seem, not the other verb thinkan, which means to think, to use your brain. That is the source of the usual word that we use, think, in modern English, because what happened is they merged into one word, but there were two distinct words in Old English. Thinkan, to seem, which this is a form of thucht, and thinkan, to think. So here it's this thing, whatever lagu is, we'll get to, is seeming. So this is sort of like a paraphrastic way to say seems. Two people, leudum, they're in the dative, langsum, endless. So this thing seems endless to people. Yif, which is if, we've had this word before, yif, he shulun nethon on nakan taltum. And actually, I think this might be another emendation. Did I miss another one? Yeah, I would amend this U to an A, personally, because we'd expect there to be a verb that is an infinitive after shulun here. This is the same verb as shall here, it's just plural here. He means, not he, because he is he. He is they. It's they as a subject or them as a direct object. Both are he, they're the same. And we're actually going to see he meaning them over here when we get to it, spoilers. So if they must or should Nathan. Nathan means to dare or to venture, to journey, to do something daring, basically. If they should dare Nathan, Nathan on nakan taltum. So naka is a word for a boat. It's just another word for boat. Old English had a lot of words for boat, and as we've seen, a lot of their poetry has to do with sailing. So yeah, naka is another word for boat. This is just on a boat, on nakan. And then we have taltum, and this is an adjective. Talt as an adjective means unsteady. It's related to the word tilt, as you can imagine, means like off kilter a bit. There's a verb that we don't actually have it tested, but we assume it existed because it's where probably the verb tilt comes from, is tiltan, which is what we'd expect of the verb if this is the adjective talt, unsteady. So if they should venture on an unsteady boat. So this thing seems endless to people if they should venture on an unsteady boat. And he xiii suida breath. And then our subject here is actually xiii, which is kind of a compound here. They put a space here. They being Hicks, we don't know if the original manuscript did, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. Xiii, sa, I think we've had this word already, means sea. That's where we get the word sea from. And then ida is waves. So sea waves. And that's actually our subject, because he is our object here. It's them. So if sea waves, and our verb is way over here, breath. We have an adverb here, though, first, suida. Suida is like greatly, to a great extent, breath. Breath here means to frighten, to be scary to someone. So if they should venture on an unsteady boat, sorry again for my computer reading my click as a right click. If they should dare on an unsteady boat or venture on an unsteady boat, and the sea waves greatly frighten them. So if this thing seems endless to people if they go out on a boat, especially an unsteady boat, and they're scared of the sea waves. And sebrimhengest bridles neyimeth. This is why I put yimeth, because yim makes no sense there. So sebrimhengest, we had brimhengest before. Now brim means sort of ocean. It's one of the poetic words for ocean. And hengest was one of those words for horse that we had before. Not in the actual horse stanza that we had with but in the xiii one, the one that was about the sun, because we were saying the sun was always a hope for seaman people on the sea. And it was until Brimhengest bringeth he to land, the seahorse brings them to land. Now we learned then that seahorse is actually a kenning, sort of a poetic, metaphorical way of saying boat. It's just like a fancy way to say boat. Your seahorse, the thing you ride on the ocean as opposed to on land. Now, we're kind of extending this kenning into like an analogy or an extended metaphor, because we say if the seahorse, the boat, bridles, and this is the word bridle, neyimeth. Yiman is the verb here. This is again why it makes sense to be a verb. Yiman is to heed, to pay attention to listen to. So yimeth makes sense. So if the seahorse doesn't heed its bridles, basically, if the boat isn't listening to you as you're trying to sail it, especially if it's an unsteady boat. So whatever this thing is seems endless to people if they go out on a dangerous, unsteady boat ride and they're scared of waves and the boat isn't like listening to them. They're not basically blaming the boat for not being good at sailing. This one I think might be possible to guess. What do we think lagu means, given that this is the stanza? Do you need me to go over it one more time, the translation? I want to see if anyone in the chat wants to try to guess this one. But I can go over it again one more time if people want. Okay, I'm going to go over it one more time, and then I'll let people try to guess if they have an idea. So it's this thing, lagu, seems endless to people if they should dare, or if they should venture on an unsteady boat, and the sea waves greatly frighten them, and the boat does not heed its bridles. The seahorse does not heed its bridles. Alright, I'm just going to go ahead and reveal it. So, this word here, lagu, means, usually it refers to the sea, just the ocean itself. Now, we've seen lots of words for sea, brim being one of them, sa being another. The Old English poets like to have lots of different ways to refer to the ocean. Lagu can also refer to other bodies of water, just any large body of water. It is related to, although it's not our direct ancestor, of the word lake. You can see it's a G and not like a hard, like a voiceless sound, like a K in modern English, lake. Because I think the word lake in modern English is influenced by the Latin word lacus. That had a C, which is a K sound. But I'm pretty sure they are cognates, the Latin word and the Old English word. So lagu is the Old English word for a large body of water. Here it's probably the sea, given that we're talking about sea waves and brim and the unsteady boat. You don't really have an endless lake. If it is endless, then it's not a lake. So that is this rune poem. Now, let's see if we can do one more. And this is going to be fun because this is the one that I probably have the most notes on to talk about. And this isn't really a guessable one because, spoilers, this rune's name is like a proper noun. I don't think it's exactly the first one if we want to go ahead and interpret this rune here, Tyr, as the god Tiw, which we talked about last time and the time before. But this one is also another proper name, probably of at least originally a deity, although it's not clear if it's a deity in this particular poem. But I'm going to go ahead and read it in Old English. First, I just want to check again that we don't need to go over any emendations. I think I missed some last time, so I don't want to make that same mistake again. I think we're good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read it. Ing was arest mid ast denum, Yesewen sejon of he sithon est over why ye wat wan after run thus hardingas von a hala nemdun. So, it's not quite an emendation. I think this is just a dialectal thing, but I tend to interpret this as this word, ast. I think we had this version here. I don't think, so there is a word est, but est, the word est doesn't make sense here in terms of what est means. Ast actually makes a lot more sense east here. So that's not quite, that's I guess my emendation, but most people just say like, this is probably just a weird dialectal spelling of ast. And we actually see ast written like ast over here. So they might have just been saving space because they already used the same word. So ing was arest mid ast denum. Ing was is was. Arist is arist, most early, or first. It's another way of saying first in terms of time. Mid, which is like with. And we have ast denum. Now, ast is east, and denum, this is the dative of Dena, which is Danes, people of Denmark. Although, in Old English, Dena could actually just more broadly refer to Scandinavians, partially because the borders that we know today between like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden were not there at the time. And when we're talking about ast denum, this is actually more likely referring to people in what is now Sweden, so like east of where we now call Denmark, and particularly probably referring to inhabitants of what is now called Götaland. Götaland, I think there's a tone there. I can't speak Swedish, sorry. Götaland, which would have been the Jats in Old English, referred to as the Jatas. Those are the people that Beowulf is a representative and eventually king of in the poem Beowulf. So that's maybe who's being referred to here, or just generally Eastern Scandinavians. That's who it seems to be referring to. So among or with the East Danes, or the Jats, the people of Götaland, he was first something. First what? Let's see. Jesewin Sejun. So Jesewin is the past participle of seon, which is to see. So Jesewin is seen. So first seen. Sejun. This un here is probably a late version of the suffix that we've seen a lot, like we just saw it here. Sejum. So you can interpret this as sejum, meaning it's sej, which we've had before. It means a warrior or a man, and it's so it's like we can interpret this as an instrumental here with a sort of commutative meaning of with or among again. So Ing was first seen with the East Danes, or among the East Danes, among warriors, or maybe among the warriors of the East Danes, or something like that. But it seems like the East Danes and the warriors are being equated in some way, or paralleled. So Ing was first seen among warriors, among the East Danes. Oath, which is we've seen before, until, he sithan asked over why you what. Over why you what. Now, until he then east over why. So over is over or through, depending on what's happening here. And this word why is probably not the word way that we saw before that just meant road or path, which is usually more spelled like W or win, E-G, way. But more, it's probably a long ash y, which means wave. It just works better metrically, I think, to have it be y. Until over the waves, or the sea. Yawat. Yawat means he went, he departed. Yawitan means to leave. I think we've had this word before. It's to leave in poetry. It's a very poetic word to use, yawitan, to depart. He departed, and usually when people yawitan, it's in the context of they're leaving on a boat or something, which is another reason why I think this is y, waves, and not just way, road. Over the y yawat. Over the waves departed. And then we have wine after ran. And this is very difficult to interpret, this part, to me. Some people I think a lot of people have run with the same interpretation of this part, but I'm going to talk about why. Grammatically, there are actually two different interpretations that mean kind of different things. Usually, people translate this as, so wine here, it's translating what's usually more commonly written with a G here, which is wine, which is wagon. That's where I get the word wagon from. Not directly, because this is more like Wain, W-A-I-N, which does exist dialectally as like an archaic word for wagon, but the G being pronounced here is influenced by other Germanic languages. But wagon after ran. So the wagon ran after. So a lot of people interpret this with like a pause here, or like a grammatical split, where it's like Ing was first seen amongst these East Danes until he departed eastward over the waves. His wagon ran after. But another interpretation is that because ran could be, it's third person, and wine, I believe, could be nominative or accusative. So it could be an object here of after, I think. Because after, when it has an accusative object, means like in the direction after. So I think it is possible to interpret it as he ran, and after his wagon ran. Like he ran after his wagon. Or after the wagon, maybe. So that's possible as well, I think. I don't think I've ever seen anyone translate it that way. But it is, I think, equally grammatically possible. Now, in either case, whichever translation you choose to go with, I think there's some, I wouldn't say agreement, but multiple people have argued that the wagon here is actually a reference to the Big Dipper, the constellation. Because wagon is a really common name in Germanic languages for that particular constellation. We know in sort of the Roman tradition of astronomy, it's called Ursa Major. That's what we call it now, because we kind of use the Roman names from those constellations now. Ursa Major is the Big Bear, because it's in the north and it's associated with bears, and that's probably, that is why we call north the Arctic, because that comes from the Greek word arctos, which means bear, because the bear is in the north, the Big Dipper, Ursa Major. But in Germanic languages, it tends to be called the wagon, and it gets called different people's wagons at different time periods and in different languages. But it always seems to be a wagon of some kind. While I'm checking on the gender of a wagon, I also want to check on Takon's pronunciation from before as well. But in either case, it's probably whether Ing is going after it or it's going after Ing. Either way, the wagon is probably the Big Dipper. Now, why? We're not sure. Why is what does Ing have to do with the Big Dipper? I've done some research on this, and I'm working on actually some scholarship on this topic right now, trying to understand what this wagon has to do with Ing and Tiu that we talked about last week and the week before, who seems to be associated with Polaris, the North Star. But it's kind of unclear. But in any case, Ing was first seen amongst the East Danes until he departed east over the waves and went after his wagon, or his wagon ran after. The Big Dipper went after. And then it says, Thus hardingas thonahala nemdun. So thus, that thus is just thus, hardingas. This is another word I have a note on. Hardingas, we might call them the Hardings if we were to modern Englishify this word. Some people translate this as barbarians. Hardings. This word hard in Old English, which is where we get the word hard from, hard, it can mean hardy, usually as an adjective, not just hard as in, like, solid, but hardy as in, like, brave. A translation I've seen for Hardingus in other contexts, not this poem, is just brave warriors. But I've also seen it in other places other than this poem, translated as barbarians, just like people who the Anglo-Saxons might not have seen as like as civilized as them. However, some people think this might be an actual like ethnic term for a group of people. I think one candidate that's been put forward by at least one scholar is the Vandals, the sort of East Germanic group that ended up traveling throughout a lot of Europe and North Africa, sort of at the sort of collapse of the Western Roman Empire. That's something that some people have suggested, is that the Hardingas are the Vandals. That's like the name for them that the Anglo-Saxons might have known. I'm not sure personally. I think it could just be brave warriors. I think it makes sense for what we're about to translate, which is that it's thus the Hardings, whoever they are, named, or called or referred to, Thona Hala. Now, Hala is another form of the word that we've seen as like Haleth before. We've seen the word like Halathas before, I believe. Hala means hero, just like Haleth means hero. It's just another form that you see in poetry sometimes. It's just Hala without the thorn at the end. So, thus the Hardings named that hero. They named him Ing. They referred to him as Ing. So Ing was first seen amongst the East Danes, among the warriors, until he departed east over the waves. Wagon after ran after wagon. He ran after the wagon, or the wagon went after him, either way. Thus, the Hardings named that hero. Now, who is Ing? Ing seems to be the deity that is referred to in Old Norse as Yngvi, or as Freyr. A lot of people think that Freyr and Yngvi are the same deity, just different names of the same deity, particularly because Freyr just means Lord. And this word Ing also shows up near the word Fra a lot, which is the cognative Freyr. Fra just means Lord, just like Freyr does in Old Norse, Freyr. So Lord Yngvi in Old Norse, or Lord Ing in Old English. There are some parts of Beowulf where Hrothgar, who is actually the king of the Danes, the Spear Danes, in Beowulf, is called Fra Ingwina, which is Lord of the Ingwina. Probably Winne is the word there. Winne means friend. So Ingwina, friends of Ing. So the friend of Ing. So he's the lord of the friends of Ing. So that's saying that the Danes are friends of Ing. They may be worshippers of this deity, as this poem seems to be saying that the Yats are. The Yats being Beowulf's people. So Beowulf, who travels from Jütland to Denmark, seems to maybe, as suggested by this poem, also have worshipped Ing, and he's going over to help the Danes, who themselves are worshippers of Ing. So maybe that's like a connection that they might have had, that they sort of revered this particular deity, especially. They would have been polytheistic, so they wouldn't have just revered one deity, but they might have had like this particular deity that they emphasized, as we can see in a lot of sources, both literary and archaeological. Different regions might have had like different gods that they sort of emphasized more than others. So it seems that it's possible that because Hrothgar is referred to as the lord of the friends of Ing, they might have had an especial relationship with that deity, and it appears that this poem is suggesting that so did Beowulf's own people. I'm actually working on a piece of scholarship also that has to do with the connections between Beowulf and this deity, and some other topics as well. So that's where we're going to stop. We're like 4 minutes after my usual end time, but I'm glad we got through this one. So I'm going to read it one more time, just to go over what's being said here. Ing was first seen among the Yats, these Swedish people, until he went east over the waves. So maybe the Baltic? Who knows? He went eastward over the waves in his wagon, the Big Dipper, went after the Big Dipper. Thus, the Hardings, maybe the Vandals, because the Vandals are an East Germanic people. Maybe he went east and then became known by the Vandals as a hero. Maybe it's talking about that. That might be the suggestion here. Now, of course, when this was written, not even just when this was written by the scribe, which was probably very late, but even when this was composed, because it's in Old English at all, it would have been composed long after the Vandals would have been known to the Anglo-Saxons at all. The people of England, I mean. So this is all just obscure prehistory to them. This is probably just passed down tradition orally. It is poetry. It's alliterative poetry. Probably was memorized and passed down before it was ever written. So it could be an obscure reference to the Vandals that kind of makes sense still as a less obscure, more vague heroes knew him as a hero. Warriors knew him as a hero. So yeah, that's Ing, the rune Ing, which it's interesting. Most of the runes we've seen so far, not all of them, but most of them have represented a sound that is at the beginning of the name. I think we've had a couple exceptions before. I think we had, let's see, what are our exceptions? I think our first exception was Eoch. We're not quite sure what this would have referred to. Some people think it is this H sound when it's after a front vowel, so it's more like a sh sound. We have some evidence of it being used that way. We also have evidence of it being used for like an A sound, especially in like what could reflect a Proto-Germanic A. In either case, we don't actually see it used a lot as a vowel in because it existed in Elder Futhark, but we don't really see any examples of it actually being used in Elder Futhark. We just see it in the line of the alphabet rows. So it's possible that this, and I think Jackson Crawford has done. No, he suggested this in a video that came out earlier today, actually, that maybe this represents a sound that existed in Proto-Germanic, because why else would both Old English and Old Norse have it? That didn't actually exist in either language anymore. It just existed in Proto-Germanic, and so it wasn't really needed for its original function anymore, and so it just kind of exists still in the rune poem and the rune rows, but it wasn't really used for its original purpose, and maybe was repurposed in Old English for some other stuff. So that's one example. Another example is this one that probably, we know it represents the x sound in Old English. It represents the z sound in Proto-Germanic and, probably in Proto-Germanic. In Proto-Norse, it's more of like a zh sound that it represents. And it's flipped upside down in Proto-Norse as well, and in Old Norse. And I think those are the only ones so far that don't represent the first letter. Ing also doesn't represent the first letter. This rune is for this ng sound, g, which in Old English the G is always pronounced as that g sound. In modern English we just say ing, but in Old English this would be ing, ing. So it would be used to represent what we would usually write with two letters. They would write with one, and that would be this one. Definitely saves space, because it's such a common sound in English, including Old English. Like if we were to write hardingas in Old English, we would probably use the rune ing for this cluster here. Okay, we're going to stop there for real. I know I said that a few minutes ago, but we're actually going to stop there. We'll get to Ethel next time. There's stuff to talk about with this rune. So thank you for being here. Thank you everyone who showed up, and anyone watching this in the future, thank you for watching. I hope you have a good rest of your time zone, and thank you. Goodbye.